What is gained by our preparatory analysis of Dasein, and what are we looking for? We have found the fundamental constitution of the being in question, being in the world, whose essential structures are centered in disclosedness. The totality of this structural whole revealed itself as care. The being of Dasein is contained in care. The analysis of this being took as its guideline existence, which was defined by way of anticipation as the essence of Dasein. The term existence formally indicates that Dasein is as an understanding potentiality of being, which is concerned in its being about its being. I myself am in each instance the being seiend existing seiend in this way. The development of the phenomenon of care provided an insight into the concrete constitution of existence, that is, into its equiprimordial connection with facticity and with the entanglement of Dasein. We are searching for the answer to the question of the meaning of being in general, and above all the possibility of radically developing this basic questions of all ontology. But freeing the horizon in which something like being in general becomes intelligible amounts to clarifying the possibility of the understanding of being sane, in general, an understanding which itself belongs to the constitution of that being seienden, which we call Dasein. However, the understanding of being can only be radically clarified as an essential factor in the being of Dasein, if the being seiend to whose being sane it belongs has been primordially interpreted in itself with regard to its being sane. Are we entitled to the claim that in characterizing Dasein ontologically as care, we have given a primordial interpretation of this being? By what standard is the existential analytic of Dasein to be measured with regard to its primordiality or non-primordiality? What then do we mean by the primordiality of an ontological interpretation? Ontological inquiry is a possible way of interpretation, which we characterized as the working out and appropriation of an understanding. Every interpretation has its forehaving, its foresight, and its foreconception. If such an interpretation becomes an explicit task of an inquiry, the totality of these presuppositions, which we call the hermeneutical situation, needs to be clarified and made secure beforehand, both in a fundamental experience of the object to be disclosed and in terms of that experience. In ontological interpretation, beings are to be freed with regard to their own constitution of being. Such an interpretation obliges us first to give a phenomenal characterization of the being seiend we have taken as our theme, and thus bring it into the scope of our forehaving, with which all the subsequent steps of our analysis are to conform. But at the same time, these steps need to be guided by the possible foresight of the kind of the being seienden in question. Forehaving and foresight then prefigure foreconception, at the same time the conceptuality to which all the structures of being are to be brought. But a primordial ontological interpretation requires not only in general that the hermeneutical situation be secured in conformity with the phenomena, but also the explicit assurance that the totality of the beings taken as its theme have been brought to forehaving. Similarly, it is not sufficient just to make a first sketch Vorzeichnung of the being of these beings, even if it is phenomenally based. If we are to have a foresight of being, we must see it with respect to the unity of the possible structural factors belonging to it. Only then can the question of the meaning of the unity that belongs to the totality of being of all beings be asked and answered with phenomenal certainty. Did the existential analysis of Dasein, which we have carried out, arise from such a hermeneutical situation that will guarantee the primordiality which fundamental ontology requires? And we proceed from the results attained, that the being of Dasein is care, to the question of the primordial unity of this structural totality. What is the status of the foresight which has been guiding our ontological procedure up to now? We define the idea of existence as a potentiality of being, a potentiality that understands and is concerned about its own being. But this potentiality of being that is always mine is free for authenticity or inauthenticity, or for a mode in which neither of these has been differentiated. Our previous interpretation, starting out with average everydayness, confined itself to the analysis of indifferent or inauthentic existing. Of course, it was possible and necessary to reach a concrete definition of the existentiality of existence even in this way. Still, our ontological characterization of the constitution of existence was flawed by an essential lack. Existence means potentiality of being, but also authentic potentiality of being. As long as the existential structure of authentic potentiality of being is not incorporated in the idea of existence, the foresight guiding an existential interpretation lacks primordiality. And what is the situation with the forehaving of the hermeneutical situation up to now? When and how did our existential analytic make sure that by starting with everydayness, it forced the whole of Dasein, this being from its beginning to its end, into the phenomenological view that gives us our theme? We did assert that care is the totality of the structural whole of the constitution of being of Daseinness, but have we not at the very beginning of our interpretation renounced the possibility of bringing Dasein as a whole to view? Everydayness is, after all, precisely the being sane between birth and death. And if existence determines the being of Dasein, and if its essence is co-constituted by potentiality of being, then, as long as Dasein exists, it must always, as such a potentiality, not yet be something. A being whose essence is made up of existence, essentially opposes itself to the possibility of being comprehended as a whole being. Not only has the hermeneutical situation given us no assurance of having the whole being up to now, it is even questionable whether the whole being is attainable at all, and whether a primordial, ontological interpretation of Dasein must not get stranded on the kind of being sane of the thematic being seiend in itself. One thing has become unmistakable: the existential analytic of Dasein up to now cannot lay claim to primordiality. Its forehaving never included more than the inauthentic being of Dasein as less than whole unganzet. If the interpretation of the being of Dasein is to become primordial as a foundation for the development of the fundamental question of ontology, it will have to bring the being of Dasein in its possible authenticity and wholeness, ganjate existentially, to light beforehand. Thus the task arises of placing Dasein as a whole in our forehaven. However, that means that we must first unpack the question of this being's potentiality for being whole. As long as Dasein is, something is always still outstanding, what it can and will be. But the end itself belongs to what is outstanding. The end of being in the world is death. This end belonging to the potentiality of being, that is, to existence, limits and defines the possible totality of Dasein. The being at an end of Dasein in death, and thus its being a whole, can, however, be included in our discussion of the possible being whole in a phenomenally appropriate way only if an ontologically adequate, that is, an existential concept of death has been attained. But as far as Dasein goes, death is only in an existential being toward death sane. Some structure of this being sane turns out to be the ontological constitution of the potentiality for being whole of Dasein. Thus, the whole existing Dasein can be brought into our existential forehaving. Can Dasein also exist as a whole authentically? How is the authenticity of existence to be defined at all, if not with reference to authentic existing? Where do we get our criterion for this? Obviously, Dasein itself in its being must present the possibility and way of its authentic existence, if such existence is neither imposed upon it ontically nor ontologically fabricated. But an authentic potentiality of being is attested by conscience. Like death, this phenomenon of Dasein requires a genuinely existential interpretation. It leads to the insight that an authentic potentiality of being of Dasein lies in wanting to have a conscience. This existential possibility, however, tends, from the meaning of its being, to be made definite in an existential way by being toward death. With the demonstration of an authentic potentiality for being whole of Dasein, our existential analytic secures the constitution of the primordial being of Dasein. But the authentic becomes visible as a mode of care. With this, the phenomenally adequate basis for a primordial interpretation of the meaning of being of Dasein is also secure. Primordial ontological ground of the existentiality of Dasein, however, is temporality Zeitlichkeit. The articulated structural totality of the being of Dasein as care first becomes existentially intelligible in terms of temporality. The interpretation of the meaning of being of Dasein cannot stop with this fact. The existential temporal analysis of this being seienden needs concrete confirmation. We must go back and free the ontological structures of Dasein already gained with regard to their temporal meaning. Everydayness reveals itself as a mode of temporality. But by thus repeating our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, the phenomenon of temporality itself will, at the same time, become more transparent. In terms of temporality, it becomes intelligible why Dasein is and can be historical in the ground of its being, and as historical Geschichtliches, it can develop historiography history. If temporality constitutes the primordial meaning of being of Dasein, and if this being seienden is concerned about its being in its very being, then care must need time and thus reckon with time. The temporality of Dasein develops a time calculation. The time experienced in such calculation is the proximate phenomenal aspect of temporality. From it originates the everyday, vulgar understanding of time. And this understanding develops into the traditional concept of time. The clarification of the origin of the time, in which inner-worldly beings are encountered, of time as within timeness, reveals an essential possibility of the temporalization of temporality. With this clarification, the understanding prepared itself for a still more primordial temporalization of temporality. In it is based the understanding of being that is constitutive for the being of Dasein. The projection and worth of a meaning of being in general can be accomplished in the horizon of time. Thus, the inquiry comprised in this division will traverse the following stages: the possible being whole of Dasein and being toward death, Chapter 1. The attestation of Dasein of an authentic potentiality of being and resolution, Chapter 2. The authentic potentiality for being a whole of Dasein and temporality as the ontological meaning of care, Chapter 3. Temporality and everydayness, Chapter 4. Temporality and historicity, Chapter 5. Temporality and within timeness as the origin of the vulgar concept of time, Chapter 6.